Hello, good morning and good afternoon. My name is Kay McGowan. I am the leader of the policy and advocacy team at the Digital Impact Alliance. I'm speaking to you this morning from my kitchen in Washington, D.C., and I'm delighted to spend the next hour talking about one of my favorite pet peeves, which is informed consent. And to get us started, I want to start with a little exercise. So I'm asking everyone around the world right now tuning in to please take a minute to close your eyes and try to recall every time you have clicked I agree in the last 10 years. And this can be to online terms of service, to privacy notifications, all those great things that we have to do every time we download a new app or update an operating system. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about that. Okay, well, if you're like me, you can remember a few of those times, but most of them are just kind of throwaway clicks, and you don't really think about what you're actually agreeing to or the implications of what you're agreeing to. That's what we're going to spend the next hour speaking with three really fascinating experts about this problem of the consent trap. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jamie Suskind, who is a barrister that works at the crossroads of technology, politics, and law. And he's also an author, most recently of a terrific book called The Digital Republic that I highly recommend. Jamie's going to talk to us about the legal origins of the idea of consent and talk to us about it in today's context as well. So Jamie, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm coming to you from London, England. And my message for you today is simple and straightforward. The consent mechanism, the one that we've just heard about, is no longer, if it ever was adequate, it is no longer an adequate way of governing our relationship with powerful digital technologies and those who own and control them. And before I sort of get onto the history, I want to just rattle through what I consider to be the main problems with consent. And hopefully all of these will be reasonably intuitive to you, because consent is something that we're expected to do every day. And once I've done that, I want to take a step back and assess the size and scale of the problem. I want to begin by outlining 8 short arguments why I think that consent is a problematic way of getting us to agree to stuff on the internet or with tech companies. And I'll take them briefly. Number 1, most people don't read the terms and conditions. 1 in 1,000 people do that. So only 1 in 1,000 are even reading the things that they are signing up to. Point number 2. Those who do read, so that 1 in 1,000, tend to read for an average of 14 seconds. These are lengthy legal documents, which if they were being read properly would take a matter of hours. So you've got only 1 in 1,000 people and they're reading them for 14 seconds. Thirdly, even if you spent longer than 14 seconds reading a particular set of terms and conditions, the likelihood is that you would find it difficult to understand because it is written in complex legal language, or it is written in a way that is so vague that it doesn't give you any sense of what's being asked of you. So for instance, a very common term on social media platforms is, we may share your data with third parties. Well, it's hard to know exactly what you're consenting to there. Fourthly, if all of us resolved that we were going to read the terms and conditions on every digital product that we were presented with, it would be physically and practically impossible to do so. So it was calculated that in 2007, if you'd read every set of terms and conditions that was presented to you by a tech company, it would have taken you 76 days to get to the end of it. That was in 2007, 15 years ago. Think of the proliferation tech that has taken place since then. We would literally be having to spend our entire lives reading documents that we don't understand. Fifth point, increasingly digital technology is not just presented to us on a screen, but is ambient in the world around us. Think of things like smart thermostats or devices that are embedded into the objects and architecture of the world, whether it's kind of surveillance devices or data gathering devices. And if you accept the idea that in the future digital technology will resemble much less a computer, a keyboard and mouse, and much more a kind of ambient, all-pervasive form of digital kind of life world, then it's not going to be possible every time we interact with the digital technology for us to be presented with a 30-page document containing the terms and conditions by which we are interacting with it. So these are all the reasons why I think the actual notion of consent is problematic. But I want to touch now on why I think the idea of even informed consent is problematic. Because the idea of informed consent is that you are being told of a particular set of options and that you are able to choose between them. But the difficulty with this is that increasingly data about us is gathered and used by very powerful machine learning systems that are able to draw patterns and inferences that human beings could never or would never have seen. The point being, you can't be told at the time you click agree what the data that you're giving is going to reveal about you, because the companies themselves don't know it. And it's not until it's been processed that its true value and meaning might become clear. So your consent isn't informed in that respect. Secondly, though, what we can't do, obviously, when we consent to a particular bit of data about us being used, is consent to or understand the cumulative effect or the cumulative meaning of that data combined with all the other data out there that exists about us that has been gathered over the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years. We've got no idea what that data says about us and no idea what it might say when it is combined with this extra new data. So the idea that we can be informed in the way that we agree is very problematic. And in fact, it's paradoxical. The consent paradox is this: to have truly informed consent, you need to have more and more information provided to you. But the more information that is provided to you, the less easy it is as a limited human being to actually process and understand that information. So the more informed you are, the less easy it is to actually understand what you're being asked to consent to. But the less informed you are, obviously you're consenting to things that you don't know or understand. Seventh point, there's an equity dimension here. Some people in society are better equipped, whether through educational or financial resources, to understand the things that they are agreeing to, whereas others are much more likely, and indeed will have much less choice, but simply to accept. And then finally, I think perhaps the most serious philosophical objection of all, when the notion of consent was developed as the kind of main paradigm by which we would govern at least the use of our data, but also our interactions with technology more broadly, it was rooted in this idea that individuals should be able to make decisions about themselves and about consequences affecting themselves. And that's rooted in a kind of noble tradition of giving people autonomy over their own lives. But the difficulty now is that when you and I consent to certain things, our decisions don't just affect us. They impact on other people too. So if I give my data to be analyzed and processed by a powerful machine learning system, what I'm not just doing is allowing that technology to understand me. I'm allowing that technology to understand people like me. So if John refuses to give his data to a particular tech company, that will matter little if Jim and Jack and Joe, who are similar to John, give their data, because that data will allow third parties to have essentially the same understanding and insight about John, even without the fact that he has consented to it. He hasn't consented to it. The point I'm making is that it used to be thought that when we were consenting or not consenting, we were just taking decisions about ourselves, but it's not right. the decisions affect other people too. To take a much more crude example, it was possible recently, when Donald Trump was president, to find his location at any given time based on mobile phone data. Now, his mobile phone was not giving away that data, but the mobile phone of one of his close security guards was. And so, by very close analogy, you can see that matter that Donald Trump hadn't consented, the president hadn't consented to giving up his personal data. The fact that someone who was physically proximate to him had done so led to some of the same consequences for privacy in any event. So these are all reasons why I think that every time that we're asked to click agree or I consent, etc., I mean, it is essentially a society scale farce. It is a system of governance that I think can be demolished in just 5 minutes of argument. And so I guess the interesting question is, why do we still have it? And what are the alternatives? So the answer to why we still have it is I think, largely historic and partly political. It's historic in the sense that it does grow out of a Western, particularly, tradition of trying to give people autonomy and control over decisions that affect their lives. And when it was, when the amount of data, for instance, that was being talked about was relatively small and was really mainly related to kind of confidential or private information, it seemed like a logical response to allow people to tick a box or to not tick a box. Obviously, the world has changed. The amount of data out there is colossal compared to what it was in the past. The ability to process that data is colossal compared to what it was in the past. That ability to process data is colossal as well. It has profound effects on our democracy, on our access to things like, where algorithms are distributing them, things like jobs or credit or insurance or a mortgage or housing or social security or whatever it is. So the stakes are higher and the technology is different. But you can see where it comes from, this idea that it is noble to give people notice of what you're going to do and then give them the choice about it. But if you think about society more generally, there are actually other ways that we regulate people's relationships with powerful entities, powerful counterparties. So put it this way, if you go to the doctor owes you a duty of care, so a duty to exercise reasonable care, that is quite separate from any contract or consent that you might have with that doctor. That is a duty that is imposed by the law by virtue of the relationship between doctor and patient. If you give your money to a banker, that banker owes you fiduciary duties, even if you don't have a contract saying that they owe you fiduciary duties to treat your money in a particular special way, owing you duties of care. Again, the law imposes that duty on a banker rather than it having to arise out of a contract. It's the same with lots of other persons in society, a pharmacist or a teacher or a parent towards their child or a government towards its citizens. Each of these relationships is governed by legal norms that are not just contractual or consent legal norms. And so what we have is this situation, I think, where you have individuals, ordinary people like me and you, who are increasingly surrounded by important and powerful digital technologies. And what we need to do as a society is impose a legal relationship between us and those who own and control these technologies that is suitable for the relationship in question. Now, if you accept that that relationship is characterized by an imbalance in power, an imbalance in financial power, an imbalance in technological power, an imbalance in epistemic power, in that the tech companies know more than we do, then what the legal mechanism should do, like the duty of care for doctors or the fiduciary duty for bankers, is that it should rebalance that power. It should help us out. Instead, what the current system does is it entrenches that power relationship. It makes it permanent. It gives it the veneer of legal credibility and legitimacy. And so it does, in my view, exactly the opposite of what it ought to be doing. So that is why in my book, The Digital Republic, I argue for the abolition of the consent paradigm and its replacement with something greater. And I know that the other speakers here today have had some great insights and experience and research in that connection. So I will leave it there. But hopefully that gives you an overview of the conceptual arguments against the idea of consent, which sounds nice and in many circumstances is great, but is simply the inappropriate legal mechanism to govern the particular relationships that we have with technology companies.
Jamie, thank you so much. I think the way you just ended that talk was perfect when you mentioned the power imbalance, because to my mind, that's what consent is all about, and people's relationships with their data, right? And so how do we move from an old system that really, it's not just not functioning well, it's actually functioning, I would say, in opposition to the original intent, right? It's not rectifying power imbalances between technology providers and users. It's actually exacerbating those power imbalances and codifying them. Every time we click, I agree. So that's the perfect segue now to bring in our other two speakers. We have Kamya Chandra, who is calling in or zooming in from Bangalore. Kamya, until very recently, was a fellow with the famous iSpirit Foundation in Bangalore, where she really focused on the policies and ecosystem plays needed to scale digital public goods, including the account aggregator network, which is a very interesting way to think about changing the relationship between people and their data in terms of who has control and decision making without being overly burdensome. We're also very, very lucky to have Kjetil Hersmo. Sorry, I already warned him I was going to slaughter his lovely Norwegian surname. But Kjetil is a senior advisor with the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. But importantly, for our purposes today, he is also an editor at Solid, which is a very ambitious effort to really re-architect the internet to change the way people interact with their data and control their data. And so let's turn it over to you, Kamya, to talk about how you and India have been thinking about potential remedies to this power imbalance and people's relationships with their data.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kay. I hope you can all see me. So I think I'd like everyone to kind of think of the last time they went in to file a visa application, right? To kind of submit all of their documents, bring it together, and sort of share it in a bundled go. Or the last time you had to apply for any kind of government paperwork, a driver's license, or really the last time you had to apply for an education loan, the last time you had to apply for, a health insurance product. And I want you to think about the kinds of data that go into that, because what I think this conversation comes down to is that everything Jamie said is absolutely correct, that the way in which consent is being utilized by some of these big tech companies and I'd say even weaponized is wrong. But that our response to it, just as you say, fossil fuels are harmful, you don't turn around and say electricity is harmful. You say, well, how else can I get electricity, right? And so our response kind of in India has been to say, well, there's a nuance in the way that you can think about the kinds of data that exist. There's very secret data, which will never be shared. So for example, biometric data would be in this category. There are all the way on the other side, public anonymized data sets, which are made available to all. But in the middle, you still have a spectrum of what different kinds of what entail different kinds of personal data, right? And this is data that belongs to you, but that is held by others. Now, even within personal data, you have different degrees of the, I'd say, intrusiveness / usefulness to you, right? And so, for example, on the left, you might have a credential that's like your degree. right? Your educational certificate or your poverty certificate, your food stamp certificate. You might have transaction data which indicates something about you, right? Or you might have what I'd call sort of the tracking data, the kind that you don't even know is being taken about you, right? I think in India what we've tried to do is to say, the data that's on this left side, the data that's about your credentials and your transactions, is actually data that's very, very useful to you. Because when you go out to sort of apply for any new service, right? When you go out to apply for a visa, apply for a loan, try to get healthcare, right? All of these service providers ask you for data. They ask you for proof of your credit worthiness. They ask you for proofs of your accomplishments or your certificates or your status. And so therefore, the data that's held by these fiduciary institutions, which belongs to you, is often just a pain to access and to share and to use for your own benefit. Whereas it's extremely easy for these organizations to use that data for their own benefit, right? And so what we've kind of done in India is to say, can we think of an architecture where it is seamless for individuals who are generating data about themselves, possibly even before they're economically wealthy, they're digitally wealthy, in the sense that there is transaction history for very, very small ticket transactions. Can I use that to improve my well-being by making that data sort of accessible to another person that I select, right? And so at this point, maybe I'd like to share the slide that, just one slide that summarizes what this framework is. It's called the Data Empowerment and Protection Architecture. And I hope you can see my screen, if you can see it at the moment. So India's data empowerment and protection architecture is a method to give an individual back control over the types of data, very specific types of data, that are extremely useful to them to reshare to a third party in order to access a service that they would like to access from that third party. So the examples are, let's say your bank statements, which is very structured transaction data, or let's say your hospital records of your vaccination certificate, right? Let's say your school certificate, or let's say your tax returns, right? Very, very specific data can be sort of shared with your consent to a third party so that it becomes seamless for you to access a service digitally. It reduces your transaction cost, not your the third party service provider's transaction cost, and it allows them to give you that service at a lower price, right? So let's say you're applying for a loan, but the interest rate is in part determined by the central bank sort of interest rate plus their transaction costs of accessing your data and underwriting it, right? So there are especially in an emerging market context, but also I'd argue in a developed country context, there are portions or elements of data that are extremely useful to an individual, and they need to be sort of accessible to that individual and shareable by that individual. So now we come to the point of consent, of how are we thinking about consent sort of in this framework? In India, the way we thought about consent is that not all consent is created equal. We take great issue with the I agree, terms and to everything, terms and consent that many apps are sort of purporting. But what we've tried to do is to craft one type of consent that might work for this set of data, right? And that consent is extremely limited on both sides of the equation, on the side of the provider as well as on the side of the user of data. On the side of the provider, it's limited by saying that the consent is granular to the data that you wish to be shared. So for example, you can change in the system that exists in India, you can sort of change the range, let's say, of the bank statement data that you'd like to share to your third party so that you just have enough to apply for the loan, right? And then on the side of the user, we have what's called purpose specification, where as part of the consent artifact, you state very clearly that this data is to be used for a loan application, let's say, and not for marketing, for business development, for third-party analytics. And that purpose specification is inscribed in the code and is also enforced by the law, because as far as the law goes, you must sort of adhere to that consent artifact that you've agreed on. The reason that this sort of we sort of built more faith in this ecosystem over time as it's scaling up now is that we don't just rely on the communication of consent to happen from the data provider or from the data user, right? I think if you take a look here and see, both the provider of data and the user of data have independent incentives which play out in the way in which they gather your consent. So let's say you're a financial information user, your incentive is to get as much data as is possible. Or if you're a financial information provider, your incentive is to give as little and to make it as difficult as possible for the data to leave your system and be used for something else. Now, the way we solve this problem is we've said, look, we're going to have an independent group of consent managers who are all private market players who all compete to give you the most informed consent possible for the specific context. And all of the consent managers are interoperable by design, by code. So just like you can't send an email, from a Gmail account and have it bounce from Yahoo, because all of the email accounts are interoperable by the SMTP protocol. Similarly, banks on either side, or let's say hospitals on either side, can't discriminate between consent managers, and you can choose any consent manager to work with either side. What this does is this allows you sort of choice and creates competition on the individual that can actually communicate to you in the best way possible, right? Of do you actually want to share this consent? So to recap kind of 2 or 3 things, data empowerment in India is framed based on the notion that individuals need control over their data in order to access services. More specifically, it refers to personal data that is transaction data or credential data, right? Second, it's mobilized through a standard technology architecture that creates interoperability and allows for market forces to work to the interest of individuals. And thirdly, it's designed in a way so that as the ecosystem plays out, we will see a competition on the right side for many different uses to become much more seamless for you. So, and this is cross-sectoral. So let's say you would apply for a visa, you can access your bank statements from any bank that is part of the network. You can share your vaccination certificate from whichever hospital or from the government provider, and all of that would be digitally signed, machine readable, and sort of completely in your control to revoke even that consent upon, and that's also inscribed in the code. So it's sort of open consent, granular, revocable, and quite secure, and has notice, embedded as part of the artifact for these specific kinds of data. And in terms of the implementation, it's scaled up in the financial sector. Actually, the better analogy, from this to this is actually open banking. So open banking in the UK, for example, is scaled up to about 5 million, I think, users last time I checked. In India, actually, the adoption of these open standards has gone up to 1.1 billion accounts, which really shows that all of these players are actually willing to share data in order to help receive it for access to services and to be able to provide services and increase the size of their portfolio. So we've seen about 2 million transactions. And whenever I show this slide, people say, we can stop presenting. But whenever I show this slide, people say, India is a huge country. Every program you have is 1 billion people. We get 300 million as your average number. But I'd point out to you that there's actually a graveyard of digital projects that never scale past 1 million. And so if something has sort of made it to sort of this level of scale, it's kind of indicative of some demand and sort of good design, or something that's working right in terms of the access. So the power of this infrastructure has been, for example, that a small business owner has been able to access a $2 loan, 160 rupees, in about 5 to 7 minutes on their mobile phone from a new financial institution that was not their existing bank. And the process was fully seamless for them because they were able to prove who they were through data of their own that was held with other institutions, and they were able to share and mobilize that data in order to access, let's say, a loan without collateral, right? A loan just based on their information collateral, which is essentially their data, their credit worthiness, their future potential, which was able to be assessed by the entity. So I think it's helpful to think through. Again, I fully agree with all of Jamie's points. I think the way that big tech kind of entities are using, especially quite harmfully tracking information about us on our smartphone needs to be dealt with strong regulation. And I don't think consent is the way to cope with that kind of data. But I do think consent can be useful for especially quite segmented and very specific data around your past transactions with any entity and your credentials. I think these are two areas where consent is a useful tool to be able to indicate my preference to share information, especially if designed in a competitive sort of ecosystem. But yeah, back to you, Kathleen. I hope I didn't take too long.
No, Kamia, that was perfect. I have to say, it's been really exciting to watch from that very first slide that you showed that I first saw in 2018 from kind of the data empowerment and protection architecture to now fruition and watching it scale so quickly. I know there's a lot of buzz in the audience chat, lots of questions coming in. We'll try to turn to some of those later, but one that I'm going to plant for you to all to think about. There are a lot of questions of, could this approach work for non-transactional data, right? So the other types of things that I'm doing online, whether it's internet searches or even some of the ambient data that's being generated by my activities. But first, let's turn to Hetal to hear about Solid. Hetal, Kamia just proposed or just described an experiment in what they call a techno-legal approach, right? Where they've had to shape the policy environment, create a new class of regulated, licensed entities, but then automated consumers' preferences over how to share their data or not, right? So Solid is an even more ambitious approach in terms of really re-architecting the internet and how data is stored and who has access and decision-making authority over sharing it or not. So could you tell us a little bit about Solid and how Solid tries to address this consent trap for consumers?
Yeah, so I very much appreciate the approach taken by Icebrit in collaboration with their government, because I think it's very, very important that we have this kind of collaboration, and not only legal, technical, but humanities, social sciences, and so on has to get involved in developing these technologies together. So if I can have my slides up, please. I can start by talking a little bit about the Solid project. So the Solid project, Solid is conceived as an extension to the web, a relatively small addition to the web. It was initiated by Tim Berners-Lee quite a few years ago, actually, at MIT. It's currently supported by a community of both individuals contributing to it and also some businesses. And the goals are very explicit, also not only in the sort of the outreach, but also in the technical documents. The goals are towards a more equitable, informed, and interconnected society. So next slide, please. So in Solid, we are taking a somewhat different approach, because the core of the system is really the access controls. So you can it's not only read, but it's also write access of different kinds to the data. And you can, as a person, you can set access controls to relatively small units of data in the among your data. And then asking consent means that you ask the user to allow access to certain data, and therefore it's more like you ask the user for access, and then by consenting to that, well, the user can change their access controls, or they can base it on some other mechanism like verifiable credentials. If, for example, the tax office is then asking you to say what your income has been in the last year, then they will be proving to you that they are actually the tax office, and therefore they have the right to see that. And so it has been implemented more as a you request access, and based on what is it that you need access to, and also then you return an access grant. So that's basically the overall picture, the high level picture of how consent is working in Solid. Next slide, please. So what struck me when as we worked on this was that what does it really change? And unfortunately, my conclusion was that it doesn't change as much as I hoped. And therefore, I really very much appreciate Jamie's account here, because it doesn't really fix the fundamental problems. There is very little progress towards that power imbalance, although it does give the owner of that data a little more leverage, since most of the data is controlled by them, and they have the access controls, but they can still be manipulated into granting access because they might not have sufficient information about how the information is used. Another unfortunate fact is that the details, like even though sort of the high level thing is very much public, the details haven't been worked out in public and has not been published. And my feeling is that if the real goal is autonomy, then the public has also has to be able to influence the details of how the system works. And I noticed that when I work on these problems, is that there are a lot of detailed questions, detailed technical problems that has a very strong influence on how the system will work, and therefore how people can actually be in control. And I think that is probably the core question for me, is that it's not really consent. Well, consent is one thing, but the real problem here is that how also we build this technology. Because consent, as Jamie says, is broken. It's really, really broken. And it's been becoming worse with recent EU legislation, the GDPR, for example, because now people are even more accustomed to just clicking OK on everything. So this does not work. I think that there is some future work in this arena that holds quite a lot of promise, because you don't necessarily need to give away all those data that you currently do so that it can be done with machine learning. It might be that asking queries over data and therefore giving up a lot less is one possibility forward that could change the landscape somewhat. It's also another possibility that you have something called zero knowledge proofs, where you can basically get to a yes or no answer. Am I creditworthy? I don't share the actual data. I share a proof that yes, I am creditworthy. And when you get to that kind of thing, then it might change the landscape sufficiently that we are getting into a better position. But as we really talked about autonomy as the reason why this noble cause has been emerged from the beginning, if the public does not influence the details of that innovation, then it might not turn out so good for them. And therefore, I'm thinking that what we actually need here is what I call institution innovation. We need public institutions that have a cross-disciplinary makeup, that have a democratic mandate to develop these technologies. And what I appreciate very much is that through iSpirit, that is where India has been starting to go. And I think that is a very interesting direction that the rest of us also have to take up in our societies. Thank you.
Geeta, that's great. And I appreciate the humility of a technologist saying so candidly that technology alone cannot solve this problem. I want to dig into the whole idea of institution innovation in just a few minutes, and maybe talk a little bit more too about this proof idea. From my understanding, you're saying it's not your data that goes to the algorithm, but rather the algorithm comes to your data, which remains under your control. That's a really interesting concept. Would love to dig into that. But since we've established now that technology alone won't get us out of the consent trap, Jamie, will legal reform get us out of the consent trap? Or do you think do you think Hetel's right that it takes more of a whole of society approach and some institutional innovation as well? But we'd love to hear, because I know you have some legal remedies that you've been thinking about. Would love to hear those from you, and then have this discussion of where the middle ground lies.
Well, here's where I agree and here's where I disagree. So I think to adequately redress the imbalance of power that exists between ordinary folks and those who own and control powerful digital technologies, we are going to need a kind of society-wide collaboration. So we're going to need innovation, and we're going to need law. I guess the cynic in me asks, how does such innovation come about and become widespread unless the law incentivizes companies to implement it? So it's just a purely practical question. Do I expect large technology companies, or indeed small technology companies, to voluntarily change the way they interact with me, when to do so would be A, not legally required, and B, possibly not in their immediate commercial interest? And I am sort of skeptical that it would happen that way. That said, part of what we're doing here today is trying to address a broader issue, which is that not only, I think, is the consent paradigm the natural legal mechanism to govern what are essentially considered to be market relations, but it is also part of a kind of intellectual paradigm which has, the imprimatur of John Locke or John Stuart Mill or kind of the Western liberal individualist tradition. So it's seen as being legitimate philosophically as well. I mean, my view is that certain transactions in society should not be regarded as apt for kind of commercial contracts at all. And this is a point that's old as Aristotle, the question about what you can and cannot sell. So in the past, it was, for instance, until laws were passed, it was legal to sell your body as security for debt, or to sell your children as security for debt. These things were all things that societies did in the past because there were no rules about what would and couldn't be consented away. And I think the GDPR point was well taken, because I think that the GDPR has taken some steps to circumventing things and saying, actually, no matter what people agree, certain data should not be used in certain ways. But what I would like to see is an expansion of the law to include more substantive areas in which, frankly, the individual consent of the person involved doesn't matter. Just as it doesn't matter if I consent to sell my body into slavery if I don't pay my debts back, because the law prohibits me from doing it. The reason I think that is because there are some overarching points of importance that shouldn't be left to individuals to decide, that for societies to decide at a kind of high level. So in terms of the kind of implementation, of course, we're going to need corporate and technical innovation. But in terms of the practical means of ensuring that kind of innovation, I think you're probably going to need intervention by the state. But I also think it is important for societies as a whole to reach views on how and why they want to impose certain restrictions on what people can and cannot consent to. And what I found really interesting in Camille's presentation was the idea that consent in respect of certain types of information should be easier to give and more practical to give, because in a sense the benefits of doing so are great and the risks of doing so are more slight. And that's exactly the kind of granular analysis that might help us to keep the consent paradigm in some places while jettisoning it in others. And I think that is really, really sensible and helpful. But again, I think that is a political choice. I think that is something that societies may differ on what they think is appropriate. One thing that I did want to ask both of my fellow speakers about is the idea of collective consent and data unions. So short of individuals, and without going so far as the state, there is this idea that you might delegate to a third party, that millions of people might delegate to a third party decisions about what may or may not be done with their data. And so they interact with third parties on sort of standardized terms that are agreed by a data union. The point being that when a social media platform transgresses something, the deterrent is not one person quitting Facebook, but 1 million people withdrawing their consent, or 10 million people. I'd be interested in what you thought of that, both kind of practically and philosophically, because I think it's a departure from the individual consent paradigm, but one which doesn't go so far as requiring the government to make particular decisions for people.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Like how can we think about different types of data fiduciaries for different types of data, right? So maybe the consent manager that was described by Kamia is appropriate for that high value, low risk data, which is of apparent commercial value, right? Whereas per the question from the audience earlier, the more implicit data, the things that are generated by your habits online or picked up by ambient sensors around you, are things that you do delegate as part of a much broader collective. I still wonder, though, how much burden that puts on individuals, even to make those sorts of choices, right? Especially when you're talking about looking across the globe, you have really different levels of digital literacy, for example, right? To even be able to make these choices in an informed way, so to speak. But Kamia, what is your answer to Jamie in terms of thinking about sorting the data, and then is the iSpirit team, are you guys thinking about other approaches beyond financial data and how to think about consent and putting people a little bit more in the driver's seat?
Yeah, so I mean, the Ministry of Finance has sort of taken control, sort of ownership over adoption of these common tech standards that would empower the consent managers. I think the framework in which we're operating, and I'll first talk about the financial sector and then about other sectors, because I think the financial sector was where we started because it's a highly regulated space. And so that provides benefits so that you can test, if something goes wrong, you can always backtrack, and they're regulated, sort of trusted, slightly higher trust entities. And I think there were sort of layers of accountability that were established in India's DAPA model for the financial sector. The first layer obviously is the law, which is the personal data protection, which is sector neutral, the PDP bill. And it doesn't go into the detail of financial data, obviously. It in principle states, around that you should have the right to, let's say, share data, and data should not be shared, let's say, with consent, right? But that's actually not even, that's been tabled in Parliament. The second layer is sort of the specific regulator or the central banker in this case, their master direction, which specifies what a consent manager is, and they're called account aggregators in the financial space, the fact that they have to compete, the fact that they're interoperable, the technology standards that they have to obey, and their interactions with information providers and users, and their ability to interact cross-sectorally with other financial sector regulated entities beyond just banks, which is powerful because it breaks those silos, right? So that's the second layer of legal. Then you have sort of the Sahamati Foundation, which is one of the examples of those institutions that Khetil was just talking about, right? Because Sahamati Foundation is sort of a collective of many account aggregators, and it tries to say, okay, how can we ensure that these account aggregators are competing in the right way? How can we bring our knowledge of the financial sector to maybe adapt and generate tools for the competing sort of consent managers or account aggregators to operate in the interest of the user? And then you have the individual sort of consent managers who are trying to, let's say, vary the way in which they show the consent information, to raise flags if there's too much information that's being asked to be shared, and things like that that look out for the user, right? To remind a user that they have a recurring consent request that they should take a look at again, things like that. But this layer, I think, of the institution, which in India sort of is run by Sahamati, is quite interesting because they are doing experiments around things like data templates, which say, okay, for specific use cases, let's say application for a loan, the typical data that's requested is 2 years of bank statements, right? And that's can be available in a template. And so at that point, if the account aggregator sort of knows from this institution that asking for 5 years of data for a loan application of this size is not typical, then the account aggregator has sort of a set of tools that they can use to sort of interact with an individual and actually flag that. And the beauty of that is the institution has sort of sector-specific intelligence, whereas the priority of the account aggregator is sort of to use that information and to interact with the user, right? So you could imagine in other sectors, creation of similar institutions, because the use of data is actually an extremely sector-specific or topic-specific area to look at. And you have to have that expertise to know what data is required, what might be excessive and things like that. So I think the creation of those institutions is very interesting. And so beyond the financial sector, the adoption of data has now sort of entered the health sector, because especially with COVID, we had to sort of generate, for example, vaccination certificates and make them available. And so they were generated to begin with in digitally signed form. They were shared in sort of a wallet form so that you could sort of share them with consent via the DigiLocker app, right, which is sort of one wallet that was created. But beyond that, about 200,000 health records are now made available on a similar system to the sort of DAPA, again, same technical standards, to allow you to share, let's say, your last, your previous medical record to your next doctor, so that they don't start from scratch, and you don't carry around these binders that our parents carried around of all of your health records from many different places, right? So I think especially in the areas of healthcare and finance, and possibly education and jobs, is where I see the highest value of being able to share and creating mechanisms to share that data as most useful to the individual.
That's terrific. Thank you. And I'm going to give the last word to Khetil to see if there's any other ideas for institution innovation. But first, because I know some of our speakers need to leave very promptly, I just want to make sure to thank all of you, including Jamie, Kamya, and Khetil. But Khetil, why don't you take us home? We've got about 1 minute left.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about adversarial readings of law, because what we see is that tech companies don't generally try to break the law. They don't do that. Instead, they try to make it moot, in the American sense, that laws stop having effect. And I think the cookie warnings is an example of that adversarial reading of laws. When I read mostly European law, and when I read European law, I see so many opportunities for making the law moot. I don't think the law is able to provide the correct incentives, because the knowledge and the implementation capacity sits in technology companies. And as long as it does that, then laws will generally be moot. Therefore, it's very, very important that society develop implementation capacity themselves. So we have to have these institutions that develop code with a democratic mandate rather than a commercial one. That is the key to balance that power.
Ketil, that is the absolutely perfect way to end. And I think you've set us up for a round 2 of the technology versus barristers and lawyers, and how we solve this conundrum. But thank you, all 3 of you, so much. This was a really rich, fascinating conversation. And thank you so much to the audience for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day.